Nonetheless, so I had a chance to hang out at Vivancos, and then I got back to the hotel, and I posted, what was going on, and I had this pleasant invite from Oriel saying, if you guys are around, do you want a tour of the city? And so I gladly said, well, of course. I mean, why would you return or turn down an opportunity to have someone local give you an encounter of the culture of the city? And it was a great experience. So these are the kinds of mindsets that I guess I would call thinking in networks. It's having that experience that by being willing to be transparent, others can discover what you're doing, and by discovering what you're doing, they can connect their own work to activities that you are involved in. The unit size of the sub-assemblies that you use to do your work influences your capacity for adaptivity. And I'll return to this as we go forward. Have you ever thought about how completely irrelevant structured learning is? I mean, if you really think about it, this is what happens in a university setting. A student comes in, they register. Now, we don't know their background. We don't know what they did before. We might have it listed on an application somewhere, but by and large, we don't know the student. We don't know their knowledge base. We don't know the kinds of life experiences that they've had. We don't know their home life. Used to be at Red River College in Manitoba. Manitoba gets a little chilly in winter. And I had a student one year who for the first month of the semester slept in his car because he couldn't afford lodging because his student loan hadn't gone through. I didn't know that. But do you think him sleeping in his car affected the quality of his learning? Well, yes. And so we don't know our students. And so it's comical in a way that we start with what we want students to know. We completely ignore the student. Then we lecture or put them into Blackboard and throw content at them. And then we have a standardized test. All of this happening outside of the existence of the student. So that's what I mean when I say it's really, the formal learning process is irrelevant for meaningful learning, because meaningful learning is one of active participation and active engagement on the part of learners. Now, we'll argue about that later, and I certainly encourage you to counter that perspective. There was a video done with a group of Harvard students, and this is over I think a decade or two ago. It was called A Private Universe. You can search for it, find the video online. They took a group of graduate students at Harvard who had just completed their education, and now Harvard, most prestigious university in the world. They've now received their bachelor's degree. End result, when they asked them why do we have seasons, one out of a group of, I believe it was about 30 students or so, 20, 30, I can't remember the exact number, but one out of this group actually knew why we had seasons. So here you have a group of people who've gone to the most prestigious school, and they could probably answer any question on an exam. But when asked to explain a fundamental concept that you learn in grade 5 and 6, they were incapable of answering it. Why? Because the school isn't structured to create meaningful learning individuals. The schooling system is structured to produce people who can mimic and duplicate content to some degree. And I would suggest one of the things we need today, there's the sense of that, learning. I mean, if you think of that word for a while, we cannot not learn, right? I mean, it's kind of like, I don't know how else to put it into a context, but we constantly learn, right or wrong, good or bad. We learn from the time we're born. We learn without thinking. It's a subconscious learning experience. We're perpetual learners. We recognized early on if you want to use the term design to what we did, but we recognized early in the design process that it wasn't what we wanted to do that was consequential. It's what the learners wanted to do, and it was the way in which the learners wanted to interact with each other and with the course content that was critical. And so by making it open, by making all of our learning experiences open, the course, the class, the discussions open, we feel we created a granular enough learning experience that allowed course participants to purpose it in ways that they found important to their context. And that's a critical distinction because it's ultimately about relevance and interest. Now, we had fairly large numbers attending and participating, but I think outside of the numbers is secondary. The real message, for me at least, was that when learners have the tools of their sense-making under their own control, they have the capacity to shape and direct the activities that they find meaningful. What is social? Many of you are likely familiar or have heard of at least Bruno Latour, his text, Reassembling the Social, and he's been quite active in just sort of questioning from a traditional sociological perspective, what is the social? And the illustration that he used in his book, Reassembling the Social, is that a lot of sociologists treat social like ether. If you remember back in the days of Einstein, well, I wasn't there, but I read. So I can't remember. But back in the days of Einstein, there was this view that so much of physical phenomenon occurred in some kind of an ether, some kind of a space that it had to occur in. And eventually with Einstein's work, that was largely refuted. And the similar perspective is one that Latour takes. He says, we use the word social like it pre-exists, right? That we walk in to social. We walk into, we dive into this pool of socialness. And Latour says, no. Social isn't like that. It's not a pre-existing state. Social is formed and reformed with each individual interaction with another individual, another student, another colleague, or another participant. So the social is not a pre-existing state. It's a continually created and recreated state. And so I want to take that context of social and open learning and focus now on connections and connectedness. And really, I think it's a different way of seeing the world. Alberto Laszlo Barabashi has put forward the assertion that, once, networks exist everywhere, all you really need is an eye for them. You need to be able to see and to recognize that they exist, but they're sort of an underlying structure of much of society. I want to take a slightly different stance than that, though, because my view is it's the connection that's primary. It's the connection that we need to focus about and understand. In fact, I would take it one step further and say we need to emphasize connections and not networks, actually, because a network is really only an expression of connectedness. A network is a pattern that reveals to others the way in which pieces are connected. Networks don't do much for us. If we look at a network diagram, we can maybe see how things are related. But what we really want to do is understand connections. How do they form? Why do they form? What is the strength of the different attributes? And why are those strengths in place the way that they are? And my argument then is that if we wish to understand education, if we wish to understand learning, and if we wish to understand the process of sense-making, our field needs a dramatic and fundamental reorientation to understanding connections. And I would argue that our research emphasis should be driven by understanding connections. The way that we create our course content, the way that we introduce them to speakers, the way that we introduce them to other theorists in the field, we really are the arbiters of connections in an educational context. So it's the type of connections that we permit, hardly unusual. Entire government systems are based on this concept, right? What kind of connections do we permit a society, do we permit individuals to form? Do we have a structured system where you can't form certain belief system? And really a belief system is a constellation of connections. So if a government says this belief system is not going to be practiced in our country, they're essentially saying we are denying the formation of this particular constellation of connections. We say democracy because it has a feedback loop and is somewhat adaptive to the context that occurs around, is a better system because it has the prospect of permitting connections to form and reform outside of heavy centralized control. But anyways, as educators, we're really just mimicking the macro process of permitting connection formations and the levels of connections that we control. And if you take it to a research model, that's really what research is. I mean, research is essentially an exploration of the validity of connections. If a black cat crosses your path, is that going to be bad luck? If you have a horseshoe, is that going to be good luck? So it's like Brian Arthur wrote in his book, The Nature of Technology, that in scientific thinking, you're fundamentally looking at a linking process. The origin of scientific theorizing is a linking process. And then the act of experimentation is a process of validating whether the assertion that this causes that, this is duplicated by that, is essentially an expression in connectedness. So, having looked briefly at some, and really very briefly at complex issues, but emphasizing that connections are the central point from which we need to cast an educational system, A course is perhaps not an ideal model for education. And the question arises, in what kind of an environment does a course actually work well? I think they work well in stable systems, right? If you have a body of knowledge that doesn't change, a course is probably not a bad approach, with one drawback. A course is still as the educator, your pre-existing combination of connections. And so you're highlighting, by default, whether you want to or not, you're highlighting certain elements and deselecting other elements. When a course is open, such as CCK 08, the Connectivism Connective Knowledge course in 08 and in 09, when a course is open, Stephen and I both have our own views, and so we inject it into the course. But because of how we structured the course, we strongly encourage that they explore and shape and adapt those connections to suit their own purposes. If you have a limited amount of information, you can package it nicely, you can create a course around it, and you can feed it to your students or provide it to your students. It's limited. So you expect them in some way or shape to duplicate what it is that you've created for them. However, when you have an astonishing level of abundance, that method doesn't work anymore. When you have an astonishing level of communication potential, it's not just information abundance, it's abundance for them to interact with others. It changes the relationship as well. And so more is fundamentally a different process. The difficult part is our education system is really about scaling. In an educational context, it's about asking, how do we control and influence connection forming and learning? Because if we have barriers and roadblocks to connection forming, generally, unless it's a very specific field, I would view that as being a negative. If we have a forum where we foster and encourage and permit the formation of new and novel connections, I would generally view that as being a positive. And so when we're designing training, or when we're designing learning, when we're delivering learning, do we have the most diverse opportunities, at the hands of our students at least, for them to be able to connect with individuals, with thinkers, and with ideas that they're personally interested in? Which brings us in the last few minutes back to really where we started, which is this open social learning focus. Why is it important? Why do we need to talk about having a social structure rather than just simply an MIT course? Why do we need to have openness instead of proprietary course materials? And I think it really boils down again to the needs of the individual and the nature of information that they're interacting with. First of all, as I stated, we don't know the needs and the experience and the context of our learners. They come at us from all walks of life and all levels of knowledge and background and personal experiences and personal home lives. So each learner has different needs. Now, we say at the end of a course we've given someone an exam, and because they gave an exam, we can grade them. And really, grading is a sorting process. It's not really evaluation in the truest sense. So we sort our students by the tests that they take. Byproduct, we end up having a model that serves the institution well, but doesn't serve the learner well. So if you have open social environments, students have the ability to adapt, to adjust, to inject new information into the ecosystem, and as a byproduct of injecting that information, the system itself changes as well. So someone comes along, and whether it's on Twitter, or on a blog, or on a YouTube video, shares a personal perspective and a view, it has a way of changing the field. PLEs, personal learning environments, personal learning networks, are a somewhat young concept in our field still. All it takes is one individual to throw out an idea, and if it resonates with others in the network, the ideas do start to begin and spiral and continue to grow. And ultimately, when you're involved in a social learning context, you have a structure that's fluid, it's variable, and it's contextual, which is critical for the learners. A course, in contrast, is simply a structure of connectedness that's been formed for learners. And our model of education, and we're thinking further down the road than this weekend, it can't, in my eyes, be sustained on a course model. It needs a more granular system, because the rapid change and complexity requires that granularity can be repurposed in multi-contexts in multiple different ways. And as a byproduct, we need to turn to the network, I think, as a cognitive agent. We need to turn to the network as a system of thinking, as a system of coming to know,